Hello everyone. So in this video, I want to discuss the issues or potential issues with making theological and philosophical narratives. It's not the case that all narratives are bad. So when I talk about the possible dangers, I'm not saying that it always occurs, but what I am saying is it sometimes does. I see it a lot and it's quite frustrating. There are times when narratives are somewhat reasonable. So what I want to look at here is when a narrative is wrong, or at the very least it is being a bit reductionist. So it's somewhat popular in our more traditional circles to make narratives of events. I see this especially among traditionalist Roman Catholics. That what happened was, this is one example, that everything was fine and good and just wonderful, and then Martin Luther, for no reason, emerged from hell and created millions of denominations to destroy the church. Or I've seen there are varieties of this version, but or of this thing, but broadly this Scotus story, where philosophy is this history of the question of being, of the analogy of being versus other systems, and it reaches its true zenith, its true peak in that of Thomas Aquinas. And then from there, Scotus, for effectively no reason, he makes being univocal, and he makes God like creatures in that way. Ockham comes along and just utterly destroys the possibility of natural theology. He's a nominalist, which ruins just a lot of possibility about reality itself. And this just cascades until you hit the Enlightenment, where Hume denies causality, Descartes has to question the outside world, and then Kant just effectively ruins everything possibly, or everything as far as possible. So I want to touch on both of these narratives and my concerns with how it's approached. So in both cases, I think there is a serious oversimplification of the way that ideas develop and the way that they affect the world, and frankly, who are the ones that are holding on to them. So looking at, first I want to actually touch on the Scotus version, or the one that starts with Scotus, so to speak. The way it's often presented is Aquinas reaches his perfect zenith, and then from there Scotus comes along and just messes all of this stuff up, and kind of for no reason. Now, what I have personally found, and I find this funny, I have found that the people that often give this story, not always by any means, but often give this story, are those who really don't actually read those who follow Aquinas, after Aquinas has died. So, these are the people that, they look only at Thomas. They might not look at other figures at all. They'll look at Thomas and those who oppose him, not necessarily his followers, until you get into maybe either your second scholasticism, your manualists. But even let's just grant that Thomas is just right on a lot. Let's just grant him that. I think he's right on a ton of things. Let's grant him that he is correct on, just for now, everything philosophical. And philosophical as it relates to theology, for that matter. Just let's grant it. At the very least, I think we can say that, his system required some degree of clarifications. And even if he is right, there are some distinct, problems with his system. Problems that I'm not saying are irresolvable or are impossible to fix, perhaps, but problems that are nonetheless ones that need greater precision, clarity, explication, and perhaps refinement to deal with some objections. So a few that I think of is, analogy of being is kind of a distinct issue. It has its strengths, it has its weaknesses. And one of those weaknesses, of course, is one that Scotus is going to come along and say, okay, well, with analogy, how do we speak of God and creatures? Are we ultimately actually equivocating, as analogy in the Thomist system, functionally equivocation. So you have to have Thomists that will respond to that. We can't just dismiss that objection as, oh, this is stupid. You have to look, well, what even is analogy going for? And along that line, Thomas never gives us, as far as I know, there's no treatise of Thomas that's just, oh, here's analogy. And there are places where he talks about analogy, but I mean, he's not necessarily perfectly, I won't say he's not consistent as though like he's just unaware of his developments, but it seems as though his thought develops from what I recall, I was reading Charles Hart's Thomistic Metaphysics, which is a great book, even though I think sometimes it can fall into a bit too much of, Thomas. Well, he is a Thomist, but you know what I mean. It falls a bit too much into like, all right, are you going to use it? It'd be nice if you use some sources beyond Thomas for Thomism. But what Hart says, from what I recall, is that when you look at Aquinas' theory of analogy, early on he is content with saying that an analogy of proper proportionality suffices as the analogy that distinguishes God and creatures. But later on it appears that he grants that to ground the analogy of proper proportionality, you need the analogy of intrinsic attribution. I'm not going to get into all of that, but suffice it to say that at the very least, you have to figure out, well, is being analogical, and if so, what kind of analogy is working here? And what do we even mean by the terms univocal, equivocal, and analogical? Because when Scotus comes along, as far as I'm aware, this is what I've heard, I can't promise I haven't read enough literature on this topic, it seems that Thomas and Scotus might be working with different definitions of univocity in the first place. Perhaps there is a distinction that one could make between univocity in concept and univocity in reality, and that could be extremely important. I've just casually heard it mentioned before that there are some more modern Thomists who are willing to say that being is univocal conceptually, but analogical really. I don't have specific names for that. I don't know, but that's something I've just kind of heard an offhand remark, so I wouldn't be surprised. But the point is, you have at least some kind of issue there that, again, not irresolvable, but something, okay, you have to examine and give further clarity. And I think Scotus is really important for that. As well, Scotus is touching on issues that Thomas's followers bring up because of arguably misinterpreting Thomas. So Giles of Rome and Henry of Ghent have their own issues, like with, say, the essence-existence distinction. I believe, and I could be wrong on this one, I always mix the two up on this, but one of them says that essence and existence is a virtual distinction, and so I think they clearly would get Thomas wrong. But the other that's also very dangerous is that the other one, I think it was Henry of Ghent that says this, that essence and existence are two separate res. That is, or res. That is, they are two separate things. And so you have existence over here, essence over here, and then for an existing subject, or an existing essence is when you combine the two. I don't know if he would use the language of a tertium quid, that it's a third thing, but at the very least it seems, well, the problem is that Scotus would recognize, and others, and Thomists themselves would do recognize, is, okay, well, how does essence exist without existence? Like, what? That seems that it has some existence where you're just pushing the problem back a step and you're not really helping at all. So that's an issue. And so Scotus is responding to them with some fairly important things. I think Scotus also gives some very good arguments for certain positions that are valuable. So, for example, I find his arguments for the unicity of God, God's oneness, fascinating. I also, maybe you don't want to say that infinity is the formal attribute of God. I personally don't. I'm more so on the aseity side of things. But at the very least, I think it is good that Scotus emphasizes infinity. I appreciate his emphases. And I really find his arguments for simplicity on the basis of infinity interesting, because Thomas moves from simplicity to infinity, Scotus from infinity to simplicity, and I find that fascinating. And I think that sometimes what's happening between Thomas and the people that are attacking Scotus as this horrible figure is that, at least philosophically, is that, well, they're not looking at the people he's actually responding to, and they're not saying that maybe there are some things that are more reconcilable between him and Thomas, things that are more reconcilable than people give him credit. So I think it was an interview with it was Pat Flynn of Philosophy for the People, had an interview with Thomas Ward and Gavin Kerr, both doctors, for the record, I should clarify. And I'm pretty sure in that, Thomas Ward said that you could formulate the essence existence distinction in a way that Scotus probably could accept. Now, it doesn't sound to me like Dr. Ward, like, oh, he's written papers on this. I think it was just an offhand, I won't say offhand, but it was kind of him, like, spur of the moment, saying, yeah, I think that is a reasonable thing to say. But the point is, I don't think Scotus is just absolutely ruining everything out of nowhere. I think there are legitimate issues that come up in Thomas's system that at the very least need to be clarified, and that's why you have figures coming afterwards. Like, I mean, I know this is a lot later, but somebody like Domingo Banez, somebody like Cajetan, and then, of course, John of St. Thomas or John Poinsot. Is it Poinsot or Pinsard? I can't recall. I actually never heard the name explicitly, or I probably have it, I just can't remember. But regardless, John of St. Thomas. Wherein they have to go through this stuff. They have to explain it, and you have the manualists and everything, and there are new issues. Like, I don't think we should look at Thomas, if, let's say I'm a Thomist, I'm not necessarily one, but let's say that I am one. I would say that we should not look at Thomas as just, all right, his system is so perfect in every single way, he has solved it, and there's no need for further developments within Thomism. I don't think you can really say that. I can't profess to have read really much Ockham at all, but I knew that Ockham has some important logical developments. And even when I look at like later thinkers, I don't think you can reduce it down to, it's just bad, worse, simply because of, Scotus causes all these issues. And then things get way worse, and it all comes back to the denial of the analogy of being, and then the denial of universals. I don't know that you can go all that way. I think there are other things going on that are going to affect this. Some of which you could argue, again, could be caused by misinterpretations of Thomas from his own followers. And so I think it's a problem just to say, okay, well, these guys come on and ruin everything for basically no reason, and that's where we are today. Again, I think there are legitimate issues with Thomas's system that at the very least should be clarified and discussed. I mean, I would say a similar thing happens, actually, I'll connect the two stories. What people often do is they say all this and they go, okay, well, the pinnacle, like the real just Satan himself was Martin Luther. Luther is the product of this nominalism, this Occamism that comes along, and he just, oh my gosh, he has a nominalism regarding hierarchy, so he denies the existence of hierarchies, or he functionally has no respect for them, so he just eliminates them. And that's the basis of the Reformation. I've even heard people like David Oderberg say that. Somebody who I generally respect, but on that point, I was like, oh my gosh, it's a horrendous interpretation of it. I think people have to recognize it, and Rome admits this too. There's nothing wrong with admitting it, that there were some serious issues around the time of Luther. Could Luther have handled things better in terms of like some of his rhetoric? Maybe, But at the very least, I think pretty much everybody admits that, yeah, there were some issues around the time of the Reformation. And the debate more so nowadays is often, okay, was Luther correct in how he addressed it? Of course, I'm going to say generally yes, Rome is going to say generally no. But at the very least, we can recognize, okay, there were some issues that it's not like Luther comes along and just, for no reasons, like, yeah, I'm going to destroy everything. Also, you should see Seth and Noah had a video a while back on Javier Perdomo's channel, I think that's how you say his name, where they argue that Luther is not just a clear-cut nominalist or conceptualist. He has like very serious Platonic elements, even though he has nominalist semantics in some areas, and Lutherans admittedly adopt more nominalist physics with respect to like the modes of Christ's presence in the sacrament. I think that's another area that is genuinely defective in Thomas's system, but we'll get into that. And then if you look at like other writings, I mean, the Lutherans, we're willing historically to say, yeah, we will accept the existence of the Pope as long as it's not, if you don't say it's divine right. We don't just deny a hierarchy out of nowhere. Luther did not reject the concept of bishops. He didn't say the Pope is, like, as I said, the Lutherans did not say, okay, well, the Pope is something that absolutely can't exist. We're not opposed to having a head of the church, so to speak. I mean, as somebody in the LCMS, President Harrison right now, right? And so I don't think we can sit down and say, okay, well, what happened was Luther was influenced by this nominalism. I don't think he was influenced by nominalism, of course he was trained in it, but I don't think we can go from he had nominalist training, which he arguably disagreed with on a lot, to, and then he applied this consistently and he just hated hierarchy in the church. I think that is such a problematic interpretation of Lutheran history as such. And then you go from there and you say, oh, well, Luther caused secularism because he made you introspect, and he denied, he made every man his own pope. Whether you want to say he ultimately, like, his system concludes with that, that's one thing. Whether you say that's how it actually worked out, I really don't think so. Because, frankly, if you read the Lutheran fathers, like the Lutheran Reformation, the most important theologians we have, I would, just looking at Chemnitz and Gerhard, for example, they do not act like that at all. They really don't. I should also note that Chemnitz and Gerhard are fairly, well, realists on a lot of things. And so, Gerhard and Chemnitz draw on Thomas for a solid amount. So it's simply not true that even if Luther were a nominalist, that somehow Lutheranism as such is nominalistic. There are tons of things that we are more influenced by Thomas on. Some of our thinkers are actually influenced by Scotus. I'm thinking of David Hallett specifically. If you read his Examen Achromaticum Theologicum or something like that, I have some of it translated for sake of some other videos. But if you read it, he's using formal distinctions. He is using just more Scotist language on a lot of things. While Gerhard, Quenstedt is pretty explicitly a Thomist, at least on the doctrine of God in a lot of ways. So we affirm things like divine simplicity and so on, where if it were the case that, oh, Luther's nominalism just caused all these problems, well, okay, why is it the case that a ton of reformers, including those like the actual, the Reformed school, why is it that they don't appear to be nominalists either for the most part? I don't know of them being nominalists. I know a ton of them are actually realists. Zwingli was a Platonist. As much as I'm not a fan of Zwingli by any means, Zwingli was a Platonist, and I would say that's what kind of got him into trouble, was that Platonism. And so my point is, it seems so easy to say, all right, Thomas fixes everything, that all the philosophical problems from before Thomas solves all of them. Scotus, for no reasons, ruins them. Simply not true. Ockham absolutely just ruins everything too. I think he had some important contributions, even though I generally don't like him. I will say that freely. And then out of nowhere, Luther, hundreds of years later, is just a total nominalist, ruins everything because he hates hierarchy in the church. And then it just all cascades from there and becomes worse. I don't think that's true. If we're to look, it's simply not the case. There are Lutheran realists. There are realists of the Reformed. There are some conceptualists within Roman Catholicism, and so on, where I'm not trying to lay the blame at somebody. I don't think we even really can lay the blame at some specific individual. That's my whole point. Were there things that Luther could have done better? Yeah. Are there things that maybe I would disagree with Luther on? Yeah, there are. But that does not mean, in my mind, that we can just lay the blame at Scotus, at Ockham, and Luther for, the state of Western civilization. That is so reductionist and so problematic. So that in mind, I'm just saying we should be taking those issues in a more complex way. We should be looking at them with a more... it's so hard for me to say phrases like nuanced and clarity and charitable without sounding like a Michael Lofton. But, we want to take things in a more, genuinely nuanced and charitable approach. So I hope this was an interesting video. Let me know what you all think. If you're interested in more like this, me going through stuff that perhaps I disagree with Thomas on, or you want me to go through some historical theology from that era, let me know. But I thought this would be a fun video to perhaps not dispel specific myths, but caution against things that I think cause certain myths to come about. So thanks for watching. Bye.
Hey everyone. Thanks for watching another Scholastic Lutherans video. If you'd like to support us, you can follow us on Twitter at Gerhard's Ghost, or contribute on Patreon at Scholastic Lutherans. There you'll get access to our Telegram chat and other perks. Links can be found in the description. Subscribe, like, or leave a comment, and have a nice day.